Hi, and welcome again back to another Candace's Corner. My name is Candace Cunningham, and I am a self-advocate that lives in Kansas City, Missouri. I have cerebral palsy and developmental disability, and I get the honor to work at the Institute for Human Development at UMKC, where we all you said. I host Candace's Corner, where we get to hear from leaders in the disability field. Candace's Corner is part of the research at the UCED at UMKC Institute for Human Development. The research speaker booth is a technical training assistant where we work with people with lived experience in developmental disabilities. This season, we are learning from leaders across the state to learn about the history of developmental disabilities in Missouri. We are talking to people who helped change the system from moving from institutional care to service that support the person in their own communities. Today, this episode is focused on family and individual advocacy in creating change, especially the autism service. I am happy to be speaking with Tec Chapman. Hi, Tec, how are you?
Hi, Candace. I'm doing really well, and thank you for this opportunity to be with you today and your listeners. So, really appreciate it.
Of course. Tec, could you tell us what you do?
Sure. Um, I currently work for Easterseals Midwest as their executive vice president and chief program officer. So, really, what that means is oversee all of our supports and services that meet the needs of individuals with developmental disabilities across the lifespan, everything from early intervention, from prenatal to 3 to autism services to employment and transition services. And then something you said in your opening remarks about helping people and supporting people to live in a home of their own in their community. And also obviously provide supports and assistance to families. And currently we're reaching about 25,000 unduplicated people throughout the state of Missouri on an annual basis.
That's amazing. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you into the developmental and developmental disability and autism services?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll probably start with the second part of your question, which is like, so what brought me into this? And, my mom was a special education teacher for 38 years in the Shawnee Mission School District over in Overland Park, Kansas area. And she taught students who were deaf and blind. And this was just something that I grew up around people who had disability. And for me, it was just a natural occurrence and typical. And so I had that early lived experience with my mom. But I think candidly, more importantly, was one of my best friends growing up was Michael, and he was my neighbor. He and I went bike riding together. We went sledding down over on Ward Parkway near what used to be the Ward Parkway Mall, and there was a big hill over there, and so we would go over there sledding, and we just had a lot of fun. And it wasn't until I got into my teenage years that somebody said to me, "Hey, do you know that he has a disability?" And I was like, "What are you talking about, man? That's my best friend, Michael. He's my buddy, man. We ride bikes. We go to Peaky's Five and Dime, and we go sledding, and he's in the same Boy Scout troop I am. Like, I don't know what you're talking about." And it was the first time I got introduced to the term first disability, and then second that he had Down syndrome. And so that just was something that he was my friend, and he was my neighbor. So I think that's what really kind of it was started early. And then when I got into junior high, that's dating myself a little bit now. It's called middle school. But being in the Boy Scouts, I achieved my Eagle Scout rank. But my project and the thing that I did was I actually looked towards early intervention services for kids with disabilities. And so did a project on that. And it showed that early intervention makes a difference. Most importantly for this child to be able to enter school to learn, but also for the families and the parents. And so I then went and spoke to a couple school boards throughout the Johnson County area about the impact of early intervention. And this was in 1980. So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was only about 5 years old at that point in time. So early intervention wasn't very prevalent. So that's really what kind of got me into the thing. It's been a lifelong journey. From a professional standpoint, I've been working in this field for about 40 years, and it started as a direct support professional, supporting people at that point in time in the state of California who were transitioning out of state institutions into what we called back then group homes. Then there were typically 3 to 6 people. And so I started as a DSP and slowly kind of worked my way up throughout the field, and ultimately ended up coming back to Kansas City in 1993 for my wife to pursue her master's degree as a dietitian, but also to start the Northwest Missouri Autism Project in 1993. And at that point in time, worked very closely with the Institute for Human Development and stuff, and ultimately became to work there. And it's just been something I've always been drawn to about just practical problem solving, working with people and with families to say, what do we need to do differently for you to live your best life? So really excited about the work that I get to do every day and the team that I get to work with. But most importantly, the individuals that our organization gets to impact positively, to learn with and from every day.
Now, I have a follow-up question. Did you guys go sledding the last snowstorm we had?
Sadly, so Michael, when I was 15, and at that point in time he was 18, he passed away.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I think we've learned a lot about physical health for folks with Down syndrome, and he had quite a few issues related to his cardiovascular system. But yes, with one of my grandkids, we did go sledding, and so that was a lot of fun, and that was her first experience, so it was a good time.
At least you get to go sledding. Awesome, and I'm sorry for your loss with Michael. Can you talk about the power of individuals and family to make change in the systems?
Absolutely. Families and individuals, with lived experience, they candidly are the clearest and the best experts about what's working and what's not working. Because every day, they're living in the gaps where things are struggling and where their needs are not being met. And they're also living in places in where they have access to necessary supports and services, whether that's early intervention, K-12 education, career, employment, higher ed, et cetera. So I think they're basically, they are the best drivers and movers for systems change. Their voices are incredibly impactful, and they bring to light the opportunities and the challenges that we need to address so that we can come up with practical solutions.
And kind of speak on it, but what happens when families and self-advocates do get to speak up together?
Yeah, obviously, I mean, we could probably, you and I both are very well aware of all of the legislative changes and societal changes that have happened because families and individuals have spoken up. And earlier I talked about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It wasn't called that before. When it was put in place in 1975, it was Public Law 94-142. And the people who drove that were parents. They were the ones that partnered with organizations like the Council for Exceptional Children and some federal legislators to say, we want our children to be educated. And when you say that all people should have access to a free, appropriate public education, that means our children too. And so parents who drove that bus without a doubt for that passage. And then I think subsequent to that, they obviously then drove the movement around subsequent reauthorizations of the Individuals Disabilities Education Act. I think about the Americans with Disabilities Act and the movement that happened there. I think about those thesis. I think about the Olmstead decision from the U.S. Supreme Court about, hey, me living in an institution is not where I want to be, and you're not meeting the tenets of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so I think those are just huge examples federally. And in Missouri, the drivers for the development of autism services, specifically in 1991, the first Autism Project, which was started in central Missouri, was driven by families that said, we need access to supports and services for our son or daughter or grandchild to continue to live at home. And we need some capacity because we're sitting here in Island. So there's a lot of people, mostly rural, who were saying they didn't have access to appropriate supports and services for their family, but most importantly for their child.
Thank you. And you touch on my next question of that the Missouri Autism Project started because of parents and families saying, hey, we need this help and to keep our child at home. And that, could you remind me of the year again? I know you just said that.
Yeah, no, yeah. The first Autism Project was started in central Missouri. So that's like that Jeff City, Columbia, Kirksville, Moberly in 1991. And the thing that's interesting to me about that is back in 1991, the incident rate or the diagnosis rate of folks with autism was around 4 to 5 individuals per 10,000. And you think about now, 1 in 35 or 1 in 36, we've seen substantial growth. So families obviously recognizing early on that they needed supports and services for their child to succeed and enter school ready to learn and have thriving lives. There's quite a few folks who I had the opportunity to work with back in the early 90s who now are adults and live in a home of their own and have jobs, and in a couple cases actually have gotten married and have 1 or 2 children. And it's pretty neat to see those trajectories. But again, families coming forth and saying, here's what our unmet needs are, and we need some help.
Families know the child. The child, the person knows themselves, not the profession knows. They can get to know them, but families or parents are the one with the child 24 hours, So it's always great for the professional to listen to the parent or to that self-advocate because they know what they need.
100%, Candace. Can't agree with you more. And again, individuals and families, siblings, and oftentimes too some other allies, professional allies have really helped to drive the system forward and to be responsive to what their needs are, to live in their own home, to go to their neighborhood school, to work at the local Chick-fil-A or work at the university or the Institute for Human Development or start their own business. Those things were all driven by individuals and people. So just love that.
Yeah. Actually, now that you said that, I'm thinking, and I know my mom will listen to this, but if it wasn't for my mom in freshman year in high school saying, you got to go to this summer transportation program hosted by IUC, I probably wouldn't be connected and have this job now. So even though I didn't want to do it, but I'm glad I did it.
Moms are a huge driving force, aren't they? They get us up every morning and get us out the door. So, and
yes, sometimes on time too. No. What was family struggles with the gaps and these early supports?
So I think back in the late 80s and the 90s, one was the scarcity of providers, especially in rural Missouri. If you lived in Kansas City or St. Louis or Springfield or Columbia, you may have access. But when you start to move outside and get into rural Missouri and you start thinking, Trenton, Missouri and Gallatin, even Kirksville, Cannibal, down in the southeast part, of the state, the Boot Heel and Farmington, West Plains, there was a scarcity. There were no providers to help them. And so they were on an island, and they were isolated as well. And so I think that was one. So basically a scarcity of, providers to support people and families with autism. And I think also too, diagnosing, there wasn't a lot of diagnostic centers or pediatricians that had knowledge that they needed. And so you can see today now all the autism centers, for diagnosing that are all over the state. I think there's 9 or 10 of them that are solely focused on that. Plus you have your private practice kind of folks too. So I think a scarcity of just the providers and access to needed services was a huge driver.
Thank you. And then with grassroots advocacy, so the Autism Projects, you said it started with the families, the effort. And then, so how important was the family advocacy in shaping the early years? It was very important, actually.
Yeah, I absolutely. It's very important. In fact, it was essential. Without the families advocating and coming forth to the state legislators and the governor at the time, it never would have come to fruition, I don't think. And the family involvement today continues to be crucial. I mean, there's now 5 autism, projects statewide, so there is coverage. But they also then created parent advisory councils for each of those projects. So parent involvement, engagement to provide guidance to each autism project, but also to the Office of Autism Services within the Division of Developmental Disabilities. That's just critical for families to continue to advocate and communicate about what their needs are, what their child's needs are, and what they want the future to look like. And back then it was about access. And today it's about, I want my child to enter kindergarten, first grade with his or her neighbors, their peers. I want them to have a job just like everybody else. I want them to have a career path. For some folks, it's going to career and tech ed, maybe it's higher education. I want them to have a home of their own. And that home can be defined any which way, Candace. It can be anything from a single wide trailer to an apartment to a house. And so I think the families continue to move things forward in pushing the system, as well as self-advocates. The voice of individuals that have that lived experience every day is a driver, without a doubt. I mean, in the driver's seat, impact that it has in communicating to the legislature and the governor and to providers to say, hey, you're doing some really good things, but here's some other things I want and I need you to do. So definitely a driver.
Yeah. And it's cool that you talked about that because later in February at Disability Rights Legislation Day, well, we will have advocates or individuals get to go to the Capitol and talk to their legislators. So, but it shouldn't be just one time. It should be all the time.
Amen. Yeah, amen to that. And I'm so thankful for all the individuals and individuals and parents and others that go down to the Capitol, whether that's in Jefferson City or wherever you live. But I think also the communication that parents do to their local school board, to their county commissioners, et cetera, to the department, to the mental health commission. I mean, it's so impactful. And you're spot on. It's not a once a year, one day a year. It's something that you need to do on an ongoing basis to this all relationship oriented. And I will tell you, the stories families and individuals share with legislators, they don't forget. I tell them a story, they're like, oh, hey, that's a provider, that's a former bureaucrat, and that you tell your story, that will resonate with them and they'll remember that.
Yeah, and I've heard even giving them a picture so they can remember that. I like that. So in 1991, Missouri created the Rule for Autism Project. How did that change things for families?
Well, first and foremost, I think it established the first Autism Project, and it created, in my mind, a structure and an infrastructure then for replication. So it started in Central Missouri in 91 and then expanded into St. Louis in like 92, 93, Northwest Missouri in 93, and then Southwest Missouri and Southeast Missouri. And so it really created a framework and a foundation for replication so that it wasn't just these families in Central Missouri, that it was able to impact families in all 114 counties in the city of St. Louis. So I think it's been huge, and it created consistency. I think it also created and validated the voices of families and individuals. And again, there wouldn't be an Office of Autism Services within the Division of Developmental Disabilities had these original autism projects not been started, and the voices of families and individuals wouldn't have come forward. So it's led to not only regional structure, but also statewide structure, and also to the development of services to meet those needs across the lifespan.
Over the last 30 years, what big system change have you been in for Missouri for people with autism?
So I came back to Missouri in 1993 to start that Northwest Missouri Autism Project with families, and it was in its infancy. I mean, we started it from nothing to a substantial service line to meet the needs of all the families in 20, 30 counties in Northwest Missouri. So I've really seen Missouri move from this kind of limited, even I would say uneven kind of supports and services and some inequities to a more defined statewide network of supports, regional infrastructure, I think more clarity around expectations and standards. And I would also say too, a more coordinated approach to autism services from the early intervention with, like, say, part B of IDA, so within first steps, to parents as teachers, to then we start thinking about K-12 education, vocational rehabilitation, higher ed, the division of DD. So I think these projects have really served as a bridge between families and, candidly, policymakers, and building these regional capacity and making sure that we have that we're providing, high value, high impact autism specific supports. And I think that's the main piece I would say around autism. Where I think 30 years ago, when an autism diagnosis was received, how we responded was not very positive from as a professional. And today, now, to say, whatever you dream of, it's possible with the right supports and services. And so I think it's been transformational for Missourians and for so many young children who are now adults who live with autism. And so I think Missouri's been a great model for that. Have we got everything right? No, but we're going to keep working at it. And I think the importance, again, the whole reason today is for families and individuals to continue to use their voice and continue to share their lived experiences and talk about where there's successes and where there's opportunities to get better and how they're living in the gaps.
So you just hit on my last question. How did the Missouri Autism Project help move things forward, and how will it move things forward, say, within the next 30 years?
So I think about that, and you think about people receiving supports and services in their home and in their community and their neighborhood school. They're working at the local businesses. And you, in your introduction of your podcast, talked about some of the changes to move things away from institutional and segregated supports and services to integrated and competitive. How the state is allocating resources. Back in the 80s, probably 75-80% of the public assistance and resources went to institutional supports and services, and it's literally flipped. It's probably 85-ish or so, 90% of the resources are going to support people in the community whether it's in their own home with mom and dad, or their own apartment, or what have you. But people are receiving the funding is going to integrated, supported, competitive employment, homes of their own, et cetera. So I'm hopeful in the next 30 years is that, self-directed supports and services continue to grow and expand. I would also say too, the utilization of technology, and how can we move to using technology to enhance our lives. I mean, I think about this device called an iPhone, and how much that's changed all of our lives, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But 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 I think how we can use technology to connect and to advance and to increase people's independence, but also their self-determination, magnify their voice. Um, and I think for people then to get the right supports at the right time, instead of there's somebody with me 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you know what? I may not need that, and it's okay. I would really love to see too. This is just more of a personal piece. There has been this whole piece about dignity of risk, and it's been around for a long time. And I think how we can move and transform the system to truly understand that, I'm taking an educated and informed risk, and it doesn't have to be perfect all the time. Sometimes life is a little messy, but if I got people like Candace standing next to me and life gets messy, guess what? She's there to support me and assist me, pick me up and dust me off, and say, "Hey, we're going to do better next time. Let's go." So I think how do we just um, continue to transform the system to truly be individual and person led, and hopefully no longer have fragmentation, between physical health, behavioral health, home and community-based services, employment, et cetera. So,
I still don't understand why there is fragmentation, but I know that's for another time.
yep, we still have work to do there, and I'm confident that individuals and families will get us to reduce those silos and decrease the fragmentation.
Yes. Well, Tech, I want to thank you very much for sharing your experience and your knowledge with us today. Your work and the work that you've done with family and all doing with families and individuals across Missouri is very important, and it helps create the real system change. Um, Thank you for being on Candace's Corner today.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I appreciate it.
Thank you everyone for watching today. We look forward to seeing you next time on Candace's Corner.